This is the, I've called this session Reconnecting People to Nature. I've given it this sort of talk several times, and when I went back and looked at my slides, I decided I'd more or less totally redo them. So anyway, so just a story about Friends of Grasslands. Now we might go to the next slide. So I thought I'd put in this warning. When, look, Friends of Grasslands has been around for almost 30 years, and it's got a very good reputation as an amazing organisation committed to supporting grassy ecosystems. And when I go through this stuff, people might think, well, that's pretty impossible to do all that stuff. But I'd like to point out, we have succeeded little by little on many occasions. And many of our major achievements have started in a small way or have built on earlier endeavours. So any of these things one can sort of take on board if one wishes. And the last comment there is there are now many cherry picking copycats, which is a good thing. So it obviously what we do has some appeal to people. Next slide. So first of all, why grassy ecosystems? I think people who want to connect to nature in some way need to have some sort of focus. And with Margaret and my case, we had this property which had a lot of sort of grasslands and grassy woodlands on it, and we had Margaret's mother at the time was pretty interested in plants, and so she started identifying the plants, and then we joined Friends of Grasslands because that seemed to be a group that could help us understand what we had. Now, natural temperate grasslands, as most people here I know, would know, they used to occupy something like 11% of southeast Australia, starting in southern Queensland, going all the way through South Australia and including Tasmania. But now only 1% of that 11% remains. Now, the beauty I find with an organisation like Friends of Grasslands is it takes an ecosystem approach, and that means it's a very rich sort of thing. And so to get one's head around it takes some effort, but hopefully we explain that as we go. Within grasslands too, there's a variety of different types of grasslands, and I've put the slide shows some of the different ones that are from around the Monero. So there's those dominated by wallaby grasses, and they tend to be high in the landscape on rocky soils that won't support other grasses, and they often have very rich in flowers. There's snowgrass dominated, so these are your river tussocks, tend to be quite close to water. Don't necessarily have a lot of flowers there. The bottom right slide is, well, it's supposed to have kangaroo grass, snowgrass, and other grasses, but that's a very diverse grassland, and that was one that was on our property, which, by the way, we departed with several years ago. So we no longer own that one. And then there's a couple of spear grasslands there. One's tall spear grass, which is pretty common on the Monero, and we might just describe that as native pasture because quite often these grasslands may not have many wildflowers in them, and short spear grasslands, but there are a number of others as well. But that just gives you an idea of some of the different communities. Then grasslands have their own suite of species, many of which are unique to grasslands. And I guess picking on one site, one ecosystem, something, it means that you can concentrate your effort, and that's a good place to start to understand nature. Next slide. Right, so this is just a quick indication of some of the diversity that we find in our grasslands, although some of the plants and animals here might be more associated with woodlands. But the top left shows you a number of different grasses in flower, if you like. And the thing I find fascinating about grasses is that when you start to look at them in flower, they're very diverse, and you can more or less tell what they are. just from the way they flower, what their inflorescence is. The next slide is just a range of daisies that you find in grasslands, and these are just a very small proportion of the ones you find. The next one, orchids. They tend to be rare. They once would have been very prolific, I imagine, but again, there's numerous orchids found in grasslands. Then going to the bottom half of that slide, we get a number of other wildflowers, or lilies and other wildflowers that are common to grasslands. Then the next part, I've just thrown in some reptiles, which are one of my favourites, and there's numerous different reptiles in our grasslands. And in the final slide, just a lot of other invertebrates and various other things. Also, I've thrown in a dingo and an echidna, various things you find in grasslands. So that just gives you, it's meant to give you an impression of the diversity that you find in a grassland. Next slide. Okay, so just a very quick potted history of Friends of Grasslands. Well, it commenced in 1994 with the idea of protecting grasslands, and very quickly people raised the discussion about, well, what about grassy woodlands? So when we finally established ourselves officially, we called ourselves Friends of Grasslands, supporting grassy ecosystems, which captured both those concepts. Friends of Grasslands actually started with a big bang, because the person who volunteered to take it on had very good understanding of group dynamics, and so was able to sort of just like a big bang explosion, and it started. And that particular person, the strategies, she adopted a number of strategies, and those strategies have remained with us, although we may have modified them and adapted them along the way. Then we got to the stage where we were a group, and then there were a number of park care groups around us, and a couple of land care groups. And what they were doing, they were removing weeds from a lot of our Canberra reserves and things like these, but they were mostly focused on shrubs and trees. And so we introduced them to the grasses and the wildflowers. And since then, just so many groups in Canberra know all about the native vegetation and are fascinated by the grasses and wildflowers and other fauna, etc., that exist in these grasslands. So it's been one of our impacts. Right from the word go, we started to do a bit of on-ground work, and then in 1999 we began our first big on-ground project at Cooma Common. We got a very large grant to do that, what was at the time a very large grant, and it was from that we the number of things fell into place, so that we had some pretty important partners working with us, and we had money to enable us to pay contractors and things to do various things. But we also ran a number of working bees, and so in that partnership arrangement, we learned to work with other groups and institutions. Then in our next sort of phase, well, those things continued, of course, but in our next phase, we got a bit interested in a thing called Stipe Native Grasses Association, and they were into pasture manipulation. So their way to change the composition of native grassland, let's call them grasslands, was to graze it in at different times and in different times of the year. So essentially that meant that if you had a paddock with a few native grasses and mostly introduced grasses, if you ate the grasses, the introduced grasses when they were about to flower, then you change the composition from a non-native pasture to a native pasture. So that was one big change. So that's another way of restoring grasslands. And then another thing, and that sort of what moved into what's now very common, regenerative agriculture. And I might say a little bit about that later. But they are things that are sort of similar to what we do, but they are quite distinct. Then about 2009, 2010, we ran some traditional values in the landscape workshops with an Aboriginal elder called Rod Mason, and that's had a profound influence on our thinking as well. Sometime further along the track, we started to give grants of our own, so we call them Grassy grants. Now, the last thing there behind the scenes, I mean, all that looks pretty spectacular in a way, but behind the scenes, we have our usual differences of opinion, strong personalities, etc. After our Big Bang, we almost imploded. So, you know, it's like any group, we've had our ups and downs. The thing on the side is we put a poster together, and this was just the some of the plants from our Top Hut travelling stock reserve, which is one of our FOG projects. So that's near Adabidimi, if people know what the geography of New South Wales, up near the mountains. Okay, next slide. If anyone wants to jump in, please feel free. Now, these are let's start to talk about some of the strands of things that we do. So I've called this next one events that we organise, but this doesn't include our work parties. So over the years, we've run a number of major and minor workshops. Often we seem to have fewer of those these days, but these are very good at sort of bringing people together to discuss an issue or to work on something in a bit more detail. We also give presentations to other groups from time to time. But the main bulk of what we do are our field trips, and our field trips well, we are based in Canberra, but we have a big attraction to the Monero and the areas around us. A lot of our field trips have been in and around Canberra on the Monero, but we've gone a lot further afield into New South Wales, been into Victoria many times, down into Tassie, to South Australia, and so on. And some of these field trips might be just a very small event, or maybe be quite large, depending on a number of circumstances. Another thing we do is we visit a lot of properties. So people say, come and tell us what we've got. We try to fit people like that in. We might encourage them to join us first, but that's another way of exciting people about what they've got. We often give them a plant list and maybe some fauna, etc. So the aims of these events are to learn and to discover, to perhaps do research, perhaps to help people plan and to offer advice. So while they're visits, they can also be called workshops in the field, if you like. So, and what we're also doing in those things is sharing knowledge and insight. So also they're an opportunity for people to get together, and they often start talking about all sorts of plants and grassland issues. And as I said, we often provide people with a species list. We do the occasional public display, and we keep records of our visits and things like that. And we used to keep hours of how many people went on these visits and how many hours were spent doing these things. Now, the two little pictures there, one is the kangaroo grass in anthesis, or in flowers. So you can see the anthers appearing there. And then another one is the fringe lily, which is obviously a spectacular and not so small flower. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So then our on-ground work has probably become the predominant things of what we do. So the value in doing on-ground work is that it's one gets us a fantastic sense of achievement, and it's a very satisfying way to learn about restoration techniques. It's a good way to teach people things and to learn skills. And the role of a team leader is pretty vital, because the team leader organises these events and does a lot of the administration, etc., etc. there are projects I've mentioned, Old Common Grassland Reserve, which sort of technically is perhaps not active at this stage, but we're still taking an interest in it. We do some work at Scottsdale, which is a bush heritage property, doing some monitoring there. Hall Cemetery is a very nice grassland with some leek orchids there, and we've been doing work there for a long time. Then we've got national lands, and national lands are controlled by the National Capital Authority. Yes, and so there are several sites. So we work closely with them on a number of their sites. They also give us some money to pay, and they buy equipment. Well, they give us the money, we buy equipment. We pay for morning teas and things like that, and it also pays for herbicide. And then there's also part of that project is Blue Gum Point, which is actually ACT government-controlled land. The next one is Budgingalingi, that's at Franklin. That's one that Margaret and I are very closely associated with. Then there's Top Hut TSR, which we talked about a little bit earlier. Oh, and then we also do some monitoring of plants for the Ginninderry Trust. So a couple of those are in New South Wales and the rest are in the ACT. Another thing, when we decided we give Grassy grants, that's also another way of trying to influence people. And people who receive our grants say, well, if we physically can contact them, we will be visiting their sites, and they sort of become clients in many ways, because they sort of trying to get an understanding of how we understand these things. So our partners, well, there's quite a number of partners: Snowy Monaro Council, Bush Heritage, ACT Cemeteries Trust, National Capital Authority, the ACT Government Offsets Team, New South Wales Local Land Services, Department of Environment, New South Wales, and Ginninderry Trust I might have there twice, not sure. No. So by forming these partnerships, we have someone who has a lot of resources. Often they don't have the particular knowledge of the plants, and they don't have much knowledge quite often too about how to manage these areas and with weeds and how to go about restoring them. So that they are great partnerships, and then we can also help direct them to do the heavier tasks we see. So we might advise them about, burning, about major weeding things that need to be done, removal of trees, etc. So those partnerships are important for us, and both sides learn. And as the last point there, the partners provide funding. So methods, tools, and resources. Well, we do a variety of weeding. We use a variety of weeding methods and tools and equipment. Yes. We're also, a lot of these sites now being burnt, which is great. We've also got mowing done on some of these sites, so using mowing as a conservation tool. We are doing spreading seeds in a lot of these places, and at Budgingalingi, we've actually got a seed orchard that the government has set up, and which it grows the plants, collects the seeds, grows them on, and then might take the next generation of seeds to spread out. And we also do monitoring of these sites, and keeping records is important. Yeah, they're just two images of a couple of our projects. The bottom one is at Scottsdale, where we're doing the monitoring. The top one is one of the national capital project sites, where there's been a lot of timber cut down, introduced trees, and you can see them lying on the ground, and we're collecting them together so that they can be removed. Next slide. Oh, and then there's some more images. So the ones on the left are of Hall Cemetery. There's a pathway through the middle of the cemetery on either side. That's been mown fairly recently, and that's kangaroo grass. But the orchids are also in there, and that's quite a diverse grassland. Got lots of different types of lilies and other flowers in there. And below that is the woodland beside that, and that green you can see is microlina. So microlands is quite prevalent there, but we've been encouraging that and pushing back the phalaris that's there. The ones in the middle of slides of Budge and Galingi, and also the bottom slide is a wetland on that site. And then the top right is, which I won't really talk about much, but for people who know about Paul Gibson Roy, this is an example of one of his, or one of ours, but adapting his ideas of a scrape and sow. Anyway, we can talk about that later if people have questions or are interested. Next slide. So, next thing is advocacy, and we've become quite a strong advocacy group. But the way I like to view it is that advocacy is part of everything that FOG does. So whether we're on a work party, a field trip, having a casual conversation, writing a submission, that's all advocating for grasslands in one way and another. Now, but the other side of that coin is that everything FOG does informs its advocacy. So we become strong advocates for grasslands because in our submissions we often know more than the people we're writing to, and so we can argue our case from the evidence that we present to them. Now, advocacy takes many forms. So you can just include casual conversations with our members or people in the community, but then also decision makers who are going to make decisions about sites, whatever, policies, and of course, getting stuff into the press is important. I should also say radio as well. And often our advocacy may involve some research, which we're becoming quite good at, and preparing formal submissions. And then the important thing about advocacy is you don't just put in the submission, you've got to sort of do the groundwork, you've got to follow up and keep representing what you're saying. And it's also follow up with different audiences. So it's important that we tell our membership what we're doing, and they often contribute to our advocacy. And we've got quite a big advocacy group at the moment, also it's a bit disorganized. Then the next level up are campaigns, where one tends to be deliberative or more proactive rather than just responding to an issue. And that usually takes a fair degree of planning, research, talking to all stakeholders, including our opponents, the people who we're trying to dissuade from doing stuff. Our advocacy work is based on an ethic, if you like, of being dispassionate. Of course, as good scientists, one should always be dispassionate, but also respectful. That rule sometimes gets broken, but you lose the plot if you start getting cross with people. And the criteria for advocacy work. So one of our problems is that a lot of people would like us to do a lot more advocacy work than we do, but we're only a small organisation. So we focus on grassy ecosystems and broader biodiversity issues that arise from that. We take a lot of interest in changes to Commonwealth, state and territory legislation, maybe not so much Victoria, but we have done some advocacy work in Victoria. Anything to do with government policy and resourcing and related matters. And some of those key things hinge around the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, and also state vegetation legislation and anything to do with management. That slide, by the way, is a picture taken at Lawson North. Defence Housing Australia want to turn that into a housing estate. So there's a long drawn out issue with that one sort of taking place at the moment. Next slide. Communications. Well, obviously communicating all these things. So we have a number of publications, News of Friends of Grasslands, which you can find on our website. That reports on FOG activities, number of articles. There's news on grassy ecosystems, and there's other information like how to contact us and various other details. We have a website, which is not the flashiest of things, but contains a lot of information about all sorts of things. So it includes our calendar of events that are coming up, includes all our past newsletters except for 5, which we haven't quite organised to get up there yet. Includes all our submissions going back quite a number of years. And then it also includes information about how people can join. And then through that, we also sell grassland and woodland flora. And there's a lot more stuff there as well. We also put out an events and notices bulletin about every month, just advertising to our members and also people on that mailing list. There's quite a few people on the mailing list who aren't members. And then we put together each year an annual report. We also have a Facebook page, and our inquiry line is info@fog.org.au. And if people contact us there, we get all sorts of queries, not that many. We do our best to answer them. We do some radio and we get some stuff in the press. And the other thing we try to do is to keep our stakeholders and networks informed. So we don't just publish stuff in the newsletter. If we're making a statement about some government policy, we try to let the government agency know about it. Next. So then, of course, a lot of this falls around our governance. I love governance and networks, but this is mostly on governance. So we're a not-for-profit organisation association, and I guess it's for groups that aren't incorporated. It's a fairly simple process to do that. Then we have a largish committee that sort of takes major decisions. So we want to go in some new direction or take on some big project, then that goes to the committee. And the committee provides some overall coordination, but by and large, where most of the work is done by project coordinators and the groups that they run. So on-ground projects, we have three coordinators doing that. So Margaret, who's there, she does Budgingalingi and Top Hut, but she's also involved in the other projects as well. Our president, Jamie Pittock, does all our National Lands project and Blue Gum Point, and then John Fitzgerald does Hall Cemetery, but he also assists Jamie in the National Lands. And yeah, thank you, Margaret. Sorry, just comments in the background there. So there are three coordinators there. There's one person taking responsibility for or trying to coordinate advocacy, which is sort of that's sort of not organised as well as it might be at the moment. There's our newsletter coordinator with a newsletter group. Our events coordination and events and notices release is got 2 people working on that. Our Grassy grants has another group that sort of advertises those, assesses the applications and organises the grants. And then we've got Sarah Sharp, who organises the sales of our books. So another thing I think we've got is we do encourage delegation and responsibility. And well, at least when I was president, we try to encourage anyone who's a member of Friends of Grasslands, if they jump on the radio and want to write a letter to the press, they can say they're from Friends of Grasslands. So they become spokesmen. So we're trying to make sure that everyone feel, that we're a group of equals. And then the other thing we have in everything we do is strong emphasis on skill development. So we're sharing knowledge all the time. We're sharing techniques on how to do things. And therefore, everyone becomes somewhat stronger. The next slide. So our members, we've had about 200 members for many years now. And it never goes below that, but never goes much beyond it either. So the members are made up of professional scientists, landowners, land managers, and volunteers. And most of our members are either professionally and/or voluntarily involved in grassy ecosystems work. So that's sort of the way it works out. with our volunteers. So FOG doesn't have any employees, so we're all volunteers, and we try to discourage hierarchies. Now, Canberra is a very status conscious city in many ways, if you've worked in the public service, and we've just got to sort of break down some of those bureaucratic things that tie up bureaucracies which don't need to apply to a group such as ours. The other sort of egalitarian things we do, we tend not to pay speakers. Well, I don't think we ever do, but obviously if we're organising a forum, we may help out with people travel and stuff like that. Many of our members are experts in one way and another, and here I put in the statement, we rely on diverse human brains. So one thing I've learned about biodiversity, it applies to everything, and it applies to humans as much as anything. And everyone's brain is different, and everyone has a different set of skills and whatever. And we can get the benefit of that. I say members learn and develop skills. And in some cases, this has actually assisted some younger people to gain employment doing some of this work, which is pretty good. And we measure our contributions, I've mentioned before. And then I've been in lots of groups, and I always think, there's always some big philanthropist out there willing to hand them over great buckets of money. It's never happened. But the philanthropy comes from within the members of the group who are providing their own time and resources constantly. And then we're now also encouraging them to dip in their pockets, particularly around tax time, to donate money to various good causes that we've got. Then the financial side of what we do, our income. So we're now getting quite a few grants to undertake on-ground work with our partners. We get a membership fee, which is $30 for adults and families, or $10 for people on a social security benefit or something like that. We also now starting to get quite good money coming in from tax deductible donations and from our book sales. Our book sales in the past have generated quite a bit of money, which has enabled us to do a lot of different things. On the expenditure side, well, the newsletter, which doesn't really cost us a great deal. Because we get these grants, we then using them for ongoing contractors and some expenses of our ongoing groups. So with one of the grants we get from the National Capital Authority, for example, that pays for the equipment that we buy and for herbicides. Insurance is quite a big one. Then we're giving out about $6,000 or $7,000 a year in Grassy grants, our Grassy grants program. That provides up to $1,500 per each recipient. Then workshop expenses, that's not very frequent. Then we may give donations to membership of other organisations or whatever other people are a bit short of money. Not that we give out a lot that way. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I thought we're getting close to the end now. So just sort of thought I'd just try to touch on some of the issues that are relevant. So keeping up with the science. Now to start with, many of our members and partners are scientists. I'm not sure how you stretch that far. I would include economists in that as well, but a lot of people wouldn't. I'm an economist. So the newsletter tries to focus on publishing many scientific findings and stuff like that and what people are doing. And then, of course, we often consult with experts in different fields, particularly on our advocacy work, or we need something. So, so keeping up with the science, I think we're pretty much on top of that. Now, farming innovation, things like no-till farming, pasture manipulation, regenerative agriculture. These increasingly rely on, a lot of these systems are relying on diversity of native grasses and working with nature. So they're very similar in a way to what we do. But when I looked at a lot of these farms or grazing properties, they never have the diversity of wildflowers that we that we have. And I think the difference is, well, they're emphasising having 100% ground cover. And once you've got your grassland established, you've got 100% cover, you know, that just choke out any wildflowers and things like that. Plus, they've also changed the nature of the soil, which perhaps doesn't favour the wildflowers much. So and what can make a big difference here is the use of fire. So the next area is traditional Aboriginal land management, which I'll cover a bit in the next slide. Then we've got some major campaigns going. So North and North Grassland, and there's also another thing, North Road at the airport, where we're trying to save a small population of the Canberra grassland eeless dragon. Anyway, they're big issues, but just to let you know about that. Then major Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act changes. As a number of people know, this has been going on for some time. We put in a number of subs on this, and we'll continue to do it because we'd like to get a good outcome. Because part of the problem that we've got at the moment is the current way in which that act is administered. Too much is being lost to non-conservation development. And then the last thing, which I might just throw in, is developing measures of biodiversity. Next slide. So can we go to the next slide? So traditional land management. So the picture there is from one of 5 workshops that we grew. That was on our property. We had this character called Rob Mason, who's actually the closest person there, but it's a bit hard. It's a bit hard to see. So one way or another, I've come to have quite a lot of involvement with a number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and I've got a fair amount of understanding of their land management practices and to some degree their culture. So as we know, fire stick farming has been used by First Nations people from before the time they arrived on this continent. And their whole concept of country is an open country. So the woodlands have fairly sparse trees, and they're pretty open. Our grasslands are pretty open. And with the removal of that fire, people who know anything about Australian history meant that a lot of the areas that Aborigines were removed from then developed quite dense bush. And today that's a major problem along our east coast with fires and stuff like that. A lot of conservationists like to talk about wilderness, but this is a totally alien concept to Aboriginal people. The country, as far as they concerned, was never wild. It was always managed. Aboriginal people did a lot to manipulate soils, water, keep water in where it belonged, and did a lot of plant manipulation, moving plants around and things like that. Something we're not aware of. They also had ways of preserving species, and as Rod explained this, he was different times in his life he was responsible for different things, but one thing he was responsible was for water birds, which meant when times were good, he could tell people where to go and hunt water birds, and when times were not so good for water birds, he would be less forthcoming in his knowledge. But he himself wasn't allowed to ever eat water bird flesh. So you sort of got a built-in mechanism, which is part of that particular Aboriginal culture, or maybe very widespread, about how you conserve particular species. Then, of course, plants and animals are a source of food, medicine and drugs, clothing, tools and hunting equipment. They're also carrying equipment, things like baskets and things like that, and so much more. So Aboriginal people had this incredible knowledge of the biodiversity of the country, and similar with farmers, they saw all these things as resources. So they sort of like sit halfway between people who are very concerned with biodiversity and people who are very, very concerned with using country as a resource. We could say a lot more about that, but I just think there's tremendous amount of knowledge there that Aboriginal people are willing to share. Then just finally on biodiversity indicators, and I was talking to Adrian about this last week, but one of the things is, now my background is in economic and social statistics, and one of the things I've always felt frustrated about working in environmental or biodiversity stuff is that there's no strong data there by which you could mount an argument. When you read State of the Environment reports and a lot of other things, they're mostly words. There's no tables, there's no real graphs. I mean, there are exceptions, but by and large, they're missing. So what I've been sort of working on, and it's just very preliminary, and I'm now trying to get other people to discuss this with me and see where we can take it, is that we would measure the following things that are there. So the first thing would be the total area of native vegetation in a particular jurisdiction, like starting with the ACT, for example, but hoping that would extend to other jurisdictions. Then you classify that by region and by different vegetation classes. And so that's the first thing. And then the next part of that is to get a vegetation condition biodiversity, I should say biodiversity condition indicator. So you look at a grassland and you think, well, what should that, how would you compare that with what would have been there in 200 years ago? And it'll probably roughly come out, if it's good quality grassland, it'll probably have half the functionality it would have had 200 years ago. So you give that a rating of 5. But there's a lot of vegetation and fauna surveys being done right in different vegetation communities, where you could then sort of come up with a number of individual indicators and put them together in one overall indicator. Now, as time goes by, that could be improved as people get a better understanding and understand better what is a good indicator, or what things together are a good indicator. And then another one would be an indicator or condition of threatened species by plant and fauna groups. So you can imagine we've got heaps of threatened species, and most of them staying the same, and some dramatically falling down. We just don't really have a good handle on this, and so if we started coming up with indicators which indicated what the condition of those is like, we could. But the thing about these indicators, you're measuring them from one time period to the next, and so you can see where things are changing. And then the other thing, which would be pretty easy to do, is expenditure by government, classified by vegetation class and by threatened species and by region. So I think there's some strong possibilities there. And next slide. And this is just one of my favourite slides taken some time ago at Alcooma Common, where over the years we've done a lot of work. And that's it, folks.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Geoff. That was very, very informative, and good to see the breadth of all the stuff you do. I'm just going to stop sharing so we can all see each other's faces, and throw it open to the group if anyone has any questions of Geoff.
Not so much a question as a comment. The biodiversity indicator thing he's looking to develop sounds fairly similar to what they use for habitat hectares here in Victoria, when they're looking to determine offsets. So you assess a particular area of native vegetation that's going to be developed and worked out how many habitat hectares that comes to, and then you've got to offset that with a similar quantity of habitat hectares somewhere else. So it's a case of you're putting numbers on things. I'm not too sure how valid some of these numbers are, but the whole offset system in Victoria is very focused on measurement and number crunching.
Yeah, I just make two comments in reference to that. So what I'm trying to do is to get, when you say habitat hectares, I mean, yeah, it's very similar to what I'm talking about. But if it's for habitat hectares of a grassland, for example, we need to know what is the total area of grasslands in a particular region. So you're just measuring what you're doing with an individual project. You're just measuring that in relation to the project. And what we don't know is we don't know the overall aggregate for it. Now, how good is the quality of that stuff? Well, I suppose I've worked internationally and nationally on statistical standards and things like that. And in a way, if you come up with a measure, it doesn't matter, because once you've got a measure there, people will start thinking of better ways of doing it. And then you can go and revise the measure. I mean, I would almost think now that many people can go into a grassland, and if they started rating them, they could give them a rating out of 0 to 10 to 1 decimal place, for example. Then you start averaging those out. One of the things I think with a lot of projects that people do is they often have to report heaps and heaps of information. Landowner who goes into one of these agreements, and they don't understand it, and possibly the person asking the question doesn't understand it. So having some sort of standards that stand outside of this would help, and might also reduce the amount of monitoring and stuff that people have to do, because we'd force this thing to become to sort of pretty common standards rather than each jurisdiction and each area developing its own. Although that's how it would start. It would start from stuff that was probably variously measured quite differently amongst different vegetation communities and across jurisdictions. But over time, you strengthen that, and I think that's the way science develops.
Yeah, there is probably another system that's going to be put in place. I know that federally they're looking at biodiversity stewardship programs for farms. They have run a trial project in New South Wales. So obviously they've got some means of measuring existing biodiversity on a farm, and then measuring the improvements in biodiversity on a farm. I haven't seen any details about how they're doing this and how much analysis is required. So yeah, there are systems popping up all over the place for measuring this sort of stuff.
And that's the sort of data I want to get access to. I mean, I know in Canberra there's a lot of that stuff being undertaken, and that's what we need to get access to. Now, often there's so many different measures there, and so you need to bring them together at a higher level, and sort of somehow amalgamate them, into a series of indicators, and then aggregate them into a single indicator. What worries me about a lot of this stuff is that it imposes a lot of data collection burden on individual projects. And I was at a thing recently with the New South Wales Minister for Agriculture, I think it was, and all the farmers there were complaining about they were filling all this sort of stuff. I think if you had a better set of statistics on these things, you'd probably save a lot of that individual burden. And I think these indicators at this very broad scale is what's missing. But anyway, I think just by starting that conversation, we may start to resolve some of these issues. But thank you for those comments. Yeah.
Yep, I see Gordon's got his hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me? Simple question. How many people do you have on your committee, Geoff?
I said it was quite large. It's about 9 or 10. It started off as a large committee. Like when you incorporate, you can have a minimum number of people on the committee, 3 probably. But our committee has always tended to discuss big issues about where we're going, how does this fit into our objectives and things like that. And so by having a large number of people, all of whom these days are all sort of doing a fair bit one way and another. Yes, but it is a large issue. But one thing I tried to say at the beginning, I always sort of felt when we was trying to venture into new things, like when we took on that Ultima Common project, I thought, well, what's the minimum we can do to get away with this? Like if we get 5 people at a working bee every, mostly every month for the first 12 months and then fade out after that, is that meaning a commitment? And so if you have this sort of like, and with organising activity, you think, well, look, 3 people would like to do this. Well, we know 3 people would like to do it and they'll get something out of it. So that's a success. If you get 20, well, obviously that's even better. But so, and I think one of the good things I think about having an organisation like ours, particularly when it comes to advocacy, the group can put in a submission. If you put that submission in off your own bat, people will probably dismiss you as a crank or something, or something like that. So, yeah, there's this strength, even if there's only a small number of people doing things.
We've got a question in the chat, Geoff, from Deb, who asks, well, thanks you first of all, but then asks what you think your greatest achievement at FOG is, and what you think has given you the biggest win for Grasslands in general.
I think the biggest achievement is really, well, when I look around me, I think, looking back, that when we started out, there were very few people interested in this who understood what it was all about, and now there's a lot of people, and across the nation, I think there's a lot of people as well. So I think it's just being part of that and being an innovator in those things and being able to take risks, etc. Look, I think we've had quite a number of big achievements, but sort of like it's all part of an organic whole, if you like, and it's our advocacy work, our field trips, it's just sort of, and they all work together. To me, it's sort of that sort of question is sort of saying, when someone's doing a political survey, what's more important to you? The environment, the climate change, education, health, the referendum on recognising Aboriginal people. They're all part of the same thing in a way. Sort of, you take out one of those things and the rest of them tend to fall down. So I guess it's the fact that it's a group that's got strong networks and a lot of other people are now on the same page, including our colleagues in Victoria. They've always been there and doing great things. And we've learned a lot from Victoria as well. I quite often quote the work. Well, I showed the book on sweeping, whatever it is, the book that came out of Victoria on the sweeping plains, land of sweeping plains. And I think that's something that gave us a lot of insights and stuff. As well.
You guys worked on that. Sarah Sharp and Rainer Raywinkle were key participants in that process. So it was it was a multi-state event, that book.
Yeah,
indeed. Any other questions, Geoff? Any other questions of Geoff while we're here? Are many of you former public servants? There's a question from Mike Norris.
Well, I am. My partner is. Yeah, a lot of people have worked in the public service, possibly a bit less. And some of the things they bring with them are good, and some of the things they bring with them aren't so good. So yeah. But our president now is Jamie Pittock. Probably many of you have heard him on radio and things like that. He's part of the Wentworth group of scientists, and he's very strong in advocacy and those sorts of things. So we've always had a fair few academics that are involved, but yeah, it's just it's a nice spread of people.
Yeah, it's a good network to have. The academic depth and the public service know how to create change within policy and government and so on.
There's too few public servants know how to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they are there. Yep.
Brilliant. Other questions from the group? Oh, yes. So none of you are paid? No one's paid.
Okay. Well, I mean, people can always contact me too, or give me a call about anything. So yeah.
Yeah. All right, Geoff, that has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for your time.